Good afternoon. I feel extremely glad to welcome everyone to this public lecture. Honorable Chairperson for KCHR, Professor K. Ganesh, Honorable Director, Professor Dineshan Vadakanil, respected speaker, Dr. Divya Kannan, distinguished scholars, and my colleagues. Today, we have a fruitful academic session by Dr. Divya Kannan on the topic Contested Childhoods, Caste and Education in Colonial Kerala. Dr. Divya Kannan is Assistant Professor in the Department of History and Archaeology, Shiv Nadar University. Her research interests include histories of empire, education, childhood studies, labor, public history, and feminist studies. She is also the co-founder and co-convener of the online Critical Childhoods and Youth Studies Collective. Contested Childhoods is her latest book-length publication. After the completion of the event, I'm sure that you all will feel enriched with knowledge on this particular topic. After the session, we will have a question and answer session. The questions can be typed in the chat box and we will read them out for the convenience of the speaker. If you still have any concerns about typing, you can ask the questions directly. For this purpose, you just click on the raise hand option. We will read your name accordingly. I feel honored to welcome you all once again for this webinar. I request Professor Ken Ganesh to take over the session. Thank you.
Welcome to Professor Divya Kannan. I think I won't take much of time and I request you to begin the lecture. And after the lecture, I may join the discussion. So please, Divya Kannan.
Thank you, Professor Ganesh. Thank you to everybody at KCHR, especially the office bearers and Gautam Das, the research assistant, for making this a smooth process. I'm going to take 40 minutes of your time today. I know it's a busy weekday afternoon and followed by a question answer session. I do have a PPT, so I'll request the coordinator to share my PPT.
Sure.
Yeah, you can start from the next slide. Yes, thank you. So for those of you who are wondering what my book is about, my book is situated in the region of Colonial Kerala. As all of you know, it was divided between the princely states of Travancore and Cochin and British administered Malabar in the 19th and 20th centuries until 1947. And therefore, my geographical focus is firmly located in my home state of Kerala. As the title goes, contested childhoods, caste, and education. Those are the three framing concerns of the book. I am particularly interested in the field of history of childhood, which has been a very established field in Europe and North America in the last few decades, but an emerging field in parts of South and Southeast Asia. And I ask a very direct question that who is the Malayali child in the 19th and early 20th century, followed by my interest in asking how does schooling become very central to the idea of the Malayali child. So all of us here, especially those of us who are Malayalis in the audience, we know that we take pride in calling ourselves a literate state. We take pride in the fact that there is educational investment of children. But as a historian, I'm obliged to point out that this has been a historical phenomenon. That why should we send children to school? Who should study? How much should a child study? What is the benefit of education? What is the relationship between education and modernity? These have been historical processes. And my book delves into these questions in much detail. I would request for the next slide to be shown. Yeah. I'm going to read out parts of my talk, but just to set the tone, these are my framing questions. Throughout the book, I am asking these questions that will then point to certain subsets where I am interested in understanding how is education related to the construction of childhood, How do we advance childhood as a conceptual category? And of course, beyond that of the child, how do we look at the role of the family and the state? And the main historical actors in my story are Christian missionaries, Protestant Christian missionaries, the London Missionary Society, the Church Missionary Society, and the Basel German Missionary Society. Three major European societies that were very active in Kerala throughout the 19th century up until 1920s. Today, we know them as the LMS, CMS, and the Basel Mission, BEM. Their schools still exist in Kerala under different names. Some of them have retained their names, some of them have been taken over by the government. And what it points out is that one, of course, the enduring legacy of the Christian missionary in the educational landscape of Kerala. But beyond that, I'm asking what kind of education did the missionaries give? And how do I depart from this traditional historiography in which we consider the missionaries only as saviors in history, right? So I'm going beyond the trope of just looking at the hero victim narrative, and I'm trying to complicate the history of education and childhood. In colonial Kerala, how and why were poor children educated, and how did schooling become integral to childhood formation? These overarching questions frame the narratives detailed in my book. Although mentioning Kerala and education in the same breath may seem trite for some, an exploration teasing out the historical configurations of schooling is important to understand the shifting cultural and political values associated with the Malayali child. Today, with the steady removal of children from agricultural and industrial labor, a declining fertility rate, smaller family units, increasing global migration, and commercial values accrued by families from an accumulation of certified educational skills, the Malayali child has become almost, quote unquote, emotionally priceless. I use the term emotionally priceless. I borrow it from a very famous sociologist, Viviana Zelizer. However, since the second half of the 20th century, this transition from an economically useful to an emotionally priceless child, marked by long years of familial protection and institutionalized schooling, has mostly occurred within urban middle-class communities in South India, like their European and American counterparts. The traditionally rich, landed upper caste and literate families have looked upon schools as a worthwhile investment to segregate and mold their children into productive, gendered, adult household members, workers, and citizens. With this context in mind, my book moves away from the scholarly attention overwhelmingly paid to dominant social groups to reveal the parallel dynamics which shaped the construction of poor childhoods in Kerala during the 19th and early 20th centuries. So I use the category of the poor child. I'm trying to move away from this focus on the upper caste child to see what is exactly happening to the poor child and who is the poor child in Kerala during this time period. Here, the term poor refers to the conditions of poverty and deprivation suffered by children belonging to oppressed castes and religious communities, including Christian converts, and the ways in which the circular logic of poverty shaped the schooling landscapes into which they were brought. As upper caste and upper class communities in colonial Kerala slowly embraced universalist notions of childhood innocence and vulnerability, advocated by various local and trans-regional actors, and agreed on the separation of children from adults in spaces specific to play, study, and leisure, those from poor laboring low caste communities continued to be largely viewed through the lens of pity and charity. So when I say the word child, many of you will immediately think of innocence, vulnerability, playfulness. And as a historian, again, I would like to point out that the association of these adjectives or these ideas are also historical. Today, we think of children as people to be protected, but almost 50, 60 years ago, 100 years ago, that was not the case. Even in poor communities, because of child labor and poverty, very often these terms are not applicable to poor children. And therefore, my question is, how do we understand the universalization of these ideas and norms across a region like Kerala today? Owing to their stigmatized caste status, poor children became regarded as undesirable, stunted, and sometimes failures, as they remained beasts of burden, rarely or never attended school, and looked towards the state for welfare assistance. Formal built schools were recognized as appropriate places for inculcating mental and physical discipline in poor children, and this category will include orphans, sick, destitute, abandoned, and delinquents, to train them in specific vocational skills and tools of self regulation requisite for changing colonial labor and moral regimes. This is not, however, a teleological narrative showing the shift of poor laboring children from the agricultural fields to the schools. Instead, my book examines the complicated encounters between adults and poor children during the past 2 centuries and their culmination in the deep entwinement between constructions of schooling and childhood that give rise to the subaltern student in Kerala today. Now, why did European Protestant Christian missions want to educate the poor? We know that this is very well acknowledged that European missionaries came to India looking for converts, and one of the methods by which they expected to attract converts were to set up schools. But we have to go beyond this conversion narrative and ask that what are the unintended consequences of setting up these schools? One, not everybody became a convert. Two, even for those who became converts, what does schooling really mean? And today we know the missionaries are not with us, and what are the ripple effects of education in our state. So I'm interested in these long-term questions. The initial experiments of Protestant Christian missions, such as the LMS, CMS, and the Basel mission, during the 1820s and 1830s, had immediate objectives. What must happen first, evangelism or education, remained a debatable matter. For the missionaries, education was laying the ground for the reception of Christianity and, by extension, norms of European civilization. This called for the establishment of schools in a widely illiterate society and the raising of a class of Christian workers necessary to expand evangelical work. The fundamental goal of mission schooling was thus to instruct colonized children to make a break with their cultural past and embody new time work disciplines, change material and faith practices, and to become model Christian communities. By the mid-19th century, Christian missionaries running higher educational institutions in colonial India acknowledged that they were not winning direct converts among the upper classes and upper castes through such work. Instead, there were calls to shift to teaching Indians the habits and ways of thinking prevalent in Europe, especially European science and literature, which would Christianize the colonized population. And as a consequence of this education, they hoped that Christianity would be accepted by the elites. But from the very beginning, this educational enterprise was premised on unresolved tensions born out of constructions of racial difference, wherein European modes of knowledge and values were regularly privileged over indigenous ones in everyday life. Existing caste codes compounded these biases, resulting in a further devaluation of the knowledge and skills possessed by poor communities. Predominantly in the arena of schooling and in the shaping of their gendered pedagogy, missionaries contributed towards cementing this difference by constantly referring and representing heathen culture. So the word that they used for non-converts was the term heathen, and they would constantly write about the heathens as inferior and undesirable. Poor children in colonial Kerala, therefore, presented a dual civilizational burden, or at least that's how I represent it. The first burden for the missionaries was owing to caste and class characterizations of them as degraded, filthy, superstitious, animal-like. And the second burden was influenced by imperial racist ideologies, which viewed colonized children as quote-unquote perverse miniature adults. This is the term by Satadru Sen, in varying degrees. So what I'm trying to say is that while we like to believe in Kerala that the missionaries democratized schooling, which is very true, we must give credit to them. Even in their schools, they were influenced by caste and class. And that determined their pedagogy quite a bit in terms of what was the nature of education they were providing to different kinds of poor children. With poor children tied closely to their families as laborers from a very young age and controlled by parental and landlord authority, Christian missions became acutely aware that one of the few places where they could control children away from their adults was that of the formal school. Please change the slides if you can move to the next one. Yes. So these are the sources that I use in my book. I look at school textbooks. As you can see, the Onnam Pata Pustakam. There are the journals by the missionaries. Those of you who are interested in archival work, you will see that the Christian missions produced millions and millions of records for almost 100, 200 years. Then, of course, the photos. These photos are from the Basel Mission Archive. It is all online and it is easy. It is free for downloading as well. So I'm using a range of sources of these missionaries. I'm also using non-missionary sources such as proceedings of the Sri Mulam Popular Assembly. I'm using government reports, commission reports, so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Can you please move to, yeah, thank you. So this is from the Church Missionary Gleaner of the CMS. And this is how they represented a slave church. So my chapter 1 actually looks at the emergence of the idea of the school. This is something that Professor Sanal Mohan has also discussed in his book. What I am trying to argue slightly different from him is very often we see Dalit efforts at education as counter-public. We see it as separate from mainstream schooling. What I'm trying to argue is that even for Dalit populations, they were interested in the idea of the formal school from the very beginning. That is why the right to education was very important along with other movements for social justice. So instead of being taught separately or in segregated spaces, subaltern populations were also invested in the idea of the formal school. So today in Kerala, you will see that all communities, irrespective of their social status, are invested in the idea of a separate educational institution where their children will be trained. That is why the schools have become such political battlegrounds as well. From the 1820s onwards, British and German missionaries located in parts of Travancore and Cochin and Malabar combined itinerant preaching with educational work. Situated adjacent to their small churches and houses, they established small vernacular Tamil and Malayalam day and boarding schools. As you know, parts of Travancore spoke Tamil because of the Tamil population. So my book looks at the Nadar community, the Tamil Nadar community in South Travancore, the Irava community in parts of Central and South Travancore, the Dalit communities across Malabar and Travancore, as well as the Tia community in Malabar. Church traditions in Britain during this period viewed literacy primarily through a utilitarian lens. And these schools provided primary instruction in reading, arithmetic, and writing, along with Christian scriptural lessons. I argue in my book that colonial childhoods are constructed as a result of imperial and local politics embedded across uneven schooling environments. Consequently, caste and poverty largely determined the pathways for marginalized children for whom childhood diverged from the normative understanding of the period as one of protection, nurture, and investment. When examining colonized children, especially the subaltern student in India, one cannot ignore their spatio-temporal coordinates, as violence is evident in these momentous shifts in literacy and schooling. In colonial Kerala, school geographies tended to remain embedded within caste-differentiated spatial regimes, resulting in multiple conflicts in spite of the emergence of mass education. Here I explore how colonial and missionary discourses on indigenous education gave way to the idea of fixed formal schools for children regulated by bureaucratic mechanisms. Although Christian missionaries and liberal thinkers and reformers throughout the British Empire advocated schooling as a measure of child welfare, local elites actively attempted to prevent mass schooling reforms and perpetuated a segregated educational system. In particular, as you can see from the picture here, I examine the slave schools, and this is a term used by the Christian missionaries, established by members of the Pulaya and Paraya slave castes, and the changing dynamics of their relationship with British evangelical missionaries, Syrian Christians, and the caste orthodoxy in parts of Travancore. These slave schools challenged the notion of fixity associated with schooling processes and ruptured the age-specific differentiation of schools. Beyond the goal of literacy attainment, the existence of such slave schools, often in an ephemeral sense, gave birth to new imaginaries of freedom and community building in the region. So what I'm trying to argue is, if you're trying to measure the success of these schools that you can see on the picture, whether they were mainstream schools, then they will fail. They cannot be considered as schools. But if you try to understand the social meanings ascribed to these attempts, you will see that there was a larger protest movement that is emerging from these spaces itself. With the announcement of mass education schemes came the possibility of children from different castes mingling in schools and redrawing the boundaries of spatial politics. On paper, education policies appeared progressive and were hailed by several British administrators as a result of enlightened governance. Upper castes in Travancore and Cochin, however, in reality, refused to compromise and entertain the idea of diluting caste rules in practice. In response to relentless petitions from Protestant missionaries about the abuses inflicted on converts from low caste communities in the 1840s and 50s, the Travancore and Cochin government defended its decision not to admit quote-unquote untouchable caste children to taluk schools, arguing that such a move would result in upper caste pupils abandoning them. So today there is a popular rhetoric in Kerala that Travancore and Cochin were very enlightened kingdoms. That term model state, that was a term that the British had given these states. But if you look very carefully, the orthodoxy in Travancore and Cochin, the Nair orthodoxy, the Brahmin orthodoxy, they were not at all open to allowing children of all castes to come in schools. That has again been a result of a protracted struggle. In fact, till about the 1920s, both Travancore and Cochin monarchies really, opposed any attempt by subaltern communities to enter schools. So they either started separate schools for them or they asked the missionaries to start schools for them. But in their own government schools, they were very, very reluctant to open it up for everybody. And they would constantly use the term custom and say that by allowing poor children into our schools, we are defying custom or we are, violating custom. That was a very major excuse used by the orthodoxy. In parts of central Travancore, such as Kottayam, landed elites often saw missionary efforts to protect agricultural laborers to provide primary education as an interference and a provocation to traditional religious practices. The potential for agrarian discontent that missionary preaching stirred with its calls for salvation from sin, universal brotherhood, and the idea of equality of believers worried many of these landlords. Several landed households feared a loosening of their control over hereditary, untouchable caste labor. As freed slaves, in 1855, the Travancore government will declare the emancipation of the slaves, and there was a fear among the landlords that the freed slaves will start moving away from their agricultural fields. Most importantly, the idea of former slave children mingling with their own children posed a threat to claims of traditional authority and feudal supremacy. In fact, Nair and Syrian Christian landlords often cast aspersions on evangelical motives. Anxious that their laborers would refuse to till the land or ask for higher wages, landlords attempted to keep missionary teachers and catechists away. Despite this hostile stance, British missionaries provided education to several freed slaves in a language palatable to them. The missionaries claimed that literacy and discipline imparted in the mission school were fundamentally aimed at eradicating the quote-unquote natural character defects of slave castes, such as cunningness, dishonesty, and thieving. a reflection of the slippage between casteist and racist notions of societal stratification. So what I'm trying to argue is that with the efforts of the missionaries to offer education, it was not a black and white process. The missionaries were coming from Europe, where class and race differentiation was very, very dominant. They come to a place like South India, where caste is a major site of differentiation, and both these sites of differentiation collapse into each other. And long before the orthodoxies, prejudices towards the Dalit communities, the missionaries also had many prejudices about the Dalit communities. So they considered them racially very inferior. They said they were unintelligent. They were only fit for physical labor. So these kind of prejudices mixed with caste prejudices. And what the missionaries tried to tell the upper caste was that if you allow us to educate the laborers, we will train them and make them obedient and disciplined so that they will become better workers on your fields. So the bargain was that of a labor supply, that we can discipline your labor and that will lead to more productive agriculture. So what I'm trying to say is that the missionaries and the landlords agreed on these larger motives, that the poor had to be disciplined through schooling processes. Missionary education, therefore, must be understood in the broader context of imperial philanthropy, into which British women and children were also drawn to define colonial girlhoods. So in my book, I'm moving away as I build a chronological structure. I look at the slave schools and then I move on to look at the boarding schools, because the boarding schools were a major site where poor children were being educated. Missionaries thought it would be easy to get poor children into the boarding schools because nobody was claiming them outside. And here in the boarding schools, they were going to experiment with new kinds of pedagogy. I would request for the slide to be changed. Yeah. So you can see that one of the attempts that the missionary did was to devalue the indigenous school of indigenous mode of education. And we know that in many communities in Kerala, the Ashan was a major respected figure, both for the Syrian Christians, for the Nayars, and for the other castes. But what the British missionaries and the government tried to do was to say that the Ashan's method was outdated, that the Ashan was actually an Oriental despot, and all the Ashan did was punish. And the Ashan was not capable of modern schooling. Therefore, what I'm trying to point out is that the emergence of the idea of modern schooling is happening alongside the emergence of the idea of the modern child. But for the modern schooling to take place, they have to now devalue and critique the traditional modes of schooling, which were caste segregated, but also focused on the figure of the Ashan. And the missionaries will say that focusing so much attention on one teacher is not modern, and there should be a separate institutional space called the school itself, where children can be trained in certain time work routines. Please change the slide. So you can see what I was mentioning earlier. These are the attempts made by the Travancore government to resist the entry of poor children into the schools. In 1867, when the Travancore government was reorganizing its education department, they were starting vernacular school certificates. You will see that the report itself is very clear that they are not interested in opening the schools for everybody. And I quote, "The distinction of caste and the strong feelings generated and kept up by it in this purely native state certainly present a grave difficulty which it is useless to conceal or ignore. The religion of the high caste pupil forbids his associating with the low caste pupil, and if the state, in the present circumstances, throw the schools open indiscriminately to all castes, the practical alternatives offered to the high caste are either that they should forego the advantage of state education or secure that advantage under serious violence to religious feelings. Both these alternatives are to be deprecated." So you can see in a very sophisticated way, the Travancore Diwan has revealed that modern schooling is only for the upper caste. It is not for all children to begin with. Next slide, please. So as I move on from understanding how the system of the Ashans are now deprecated, many of the Ashans will start joining these missionary schools and government schools. And another site I'm interested in, along with day schools, is to look at the boarding school. And my second chapter focuses on girls schooling at the same time, because the missionaries were some of the earliest to encourage poor girls to get formal schooling. While on the one hand, the figure of the child wife, dragged to death to perform sati, became a prominent motive for Indian cultural defects and violence in colonial discourses, on the other hand, the quote-unquote untouchable caste girl became a recurring theme in evangelical philanthropy to socialize ordinary British women and children into becoming saviors from afar. As the condition of girls belonging to oppressed laboring castes was also portrayed as a sign of civilizational backwardness in colonial India, evangelical Protestant missions intended to transform poor girls as agents of individual and community change through formal schooling and training in what was considered a scientific form of domestic household management. Transcribed within a domain of sexual purity that was sought to be contained through strict boarding school routines, colonial girlhoods were simultaneously constituted within the limits of a gendered politics of piety. In using poor girls' labor to maintain missionary establishments, often unacknowledged and unremunerated, European missionaries participated in extractive colonial labor regimes. In many parts of the Indian subcontinent, destitute girls were actively sought out by missionary catechists and teachers and admitted to a boarding school education that did not seek to entirely alienate them culturally from their natal surroundings or distance them from traditional forms of manual labor. So again, you will see how gender is a new inflection in the question of pedagogy. The missionaries were debating why should girls be educated, what is the value of educating poor girls. We know that in colonial India, sati was a major point of discussion, but that was happening in the Bengal presidency. But in parts of Madras presidency and in the princely states, there was a question of slavery and bonded labor and the question of what will happen to the poor girl. So especially in South Travancore, today the community of the Nadars were the first ones to start sending their girls to missionary schools. Some were Christian, some were not Christian. But the missionary was not very keen to educate the girl in the same way as the boy. So for one, missionaries refused to teach girls in English. Today also we see the same problem that very often girls are not encouraged to pick up English language because it's considered as alienating them from cultural surroundings. So you will see in the 19th century same concerns. Girls were expected to learn domestic tasks in the schools. You can see from the picture I have shown you that in the afternoon they were spinning cotton, they were asked to do embroidery, they were asked to learn sewing. So all of these tasks were also highly gendered based on their so-called gendered capacities. Whereas boys were trained in carpentry, in blacksmithery, in printing, in other forms of manual labor, poor girls were expected to become very respectable women within the household. So the idea was that the poor girl must be taken away from the agricultural field and converted into this very respectable figure who will manage her sexual purity and chastity, while at the same time she would also be very pious and religious and literate. And we will soon see that this will have many, many contradictions as many poor educated Nadar girls are going to protest against the Nayar women wearing only not allowing them to wear the blouse. And in the 1830s up till the 50s, in the breast cloth controversy, as we all know, the same educated girls of these boarding schools were at the forefront of these struggles. At the turn of the century, educational changes, albeit numerically not substantial, had far-reaching consequences as subaltern community mobilizations emerged in these regions. And Christian girls became the symbols of new aspirations. But who would study in these segregated settings and how much remain difficult questions? Because after all, to teach students in boarding schools, you had to ask them to leave their homes. And most families, poor or rich, they were not willing to send their girls away because of concerns of respectability. And you will see that the missionaries are coercing them. Sometimes they're giving them money. Sometimes they're persuading them. Sometimes they're taking orphan children. So they are also trying different ways to attract poor children into the schools. Through tropes of maternalism, in a language familiar to their standing in British society, an early generation of married missionary female workers adopted a highly ideological and political role, belying the oft-quoted assumption that white women, especially those in pursuit of religious causes, were simply the softer evangelical faces of the empire. So one of my attempts in the chapter on gender is to basically break down the idea that white women are not political, that white women were not as imperial as white men. And today we know from the conflict in Gaza, from the conflict in Lebanon, and from the results of the US elections, we know that white women are as political as white men, if not more. But in the missionary text, there is this idea that white women are only interested in charity and philanthropy, and therefore they are not going to participate in any kind of imperial project. This is completely untrue. Christian missionary European women wrote large amounts of correspondence back to England and other parts of Europe in which they orientalized the East, in which they stereotyped Indian populations, in which they participated in the propaganda that imperialism must remain and that the British Raj must remain because the Indians were uncivilized. And one of the ways in which missionary women did that was by participating in educational enterprise. Of course, you may ask the question, was it very aggressive and very direct? Well, not really. But through their writings, you will see the way they represented the Indian poor child as vulnerable, as voiceless, as hapless, as a completely agency-less figure is an indication of the kind of philanthropy that was emerging. Today, we see the same language happening in Africa. Whenever you see pictures of African children, they are portrayed as if they have no agency or no choice in their lives. And, a lot of organizations try to provoke certain humanitarian sentiments by completely isolating the fact that poverty in Africa today is a result of political actions and misdeliberations. So similarly, you will see in the 19th century, missionary women are participating in female education. And I argue that this is a political enterprise as much as it's a cultural enterprise. Next slide, please. So you can see this is from the LMS sewing class. You can see in the boarding school, they were all given same uniforms. Sewing was a major activity. One, it was for economic reasons. They wanted poor girls to learn some skill by which they could make some money. But you will see from the archives that very often the funds that were raised by sewing was actually used to fund British soldiers in various wars of the empire. So for example, the LMS Nagarkoil lace industry and the Neyur embroidery industry, whatever little profit that the girls were making, it was sometimes donated to war funds happening in Mesopotamia or in Belgium and other parts of the empire. Sometimes the money was used to fund church furniture. Sometimes the money was also used as dowry for the girls when they were married. So again, what I'm trying to point out is that there is this circular logic of both education and labor. While the missionaries said that they are giving free education to poor children in Travancore, history tells us that this is actually not really free. Nothing is really free. The poor children are doing a lot of labor in the boarding schools. They're actually doing free labor in the boarding schools for the missionaries, but that is not being acknowledged at all. Next slide, please. So you will see the Basel mission as well. They all had similar arrangements. They gave the most minimal resources to the boarding school girls and boys. The assumption is that poor children did not require much. The assumption also was that we are not educating the poor children to become Mem Sahibs or officers in the presidency towns. We are only educating them to become better workers on the fields, in the households, and in the families. So the idea was that poor children had to be trained to become better subordinate labor in the capitalist system and not necessarily compete for white collar jobs. And we will see by the 20th century, this is going to create great tension as colonial Kerala has increasing rate of unemployment, and more poor educated boys and girls will say that they refuse to do manual labor. Next slide, please. So the Chapter 3 also looks at boarding schools. So while I look at girls' boarding schools in South Travancore, in comparison, I look at the Basel Mission schools. Those of you who are not familiar with the Basel Mission, Basel is a city in Switzerland. It's a very prosperous city, usually controlled by business elites. But in the 1830s, they started a missionary society called the Basel Evangelical German Missionary Society. And they are called German because 99% of the workers or the men who came into that society, they came from South Germany, what is called Württemberg, the districts of Württemberg. And because they were all poor German men, they were ordinary school teachers, artisans, carpenters, so on and so forth. There was a very strong German character to the activities of the Basel Mission. Today in Kerala, we are familiar with the Basel Mission because of Hermann Gundert. Hermann Gundert was one of the major missionaries of the Basel Mission. He was the first one to come to Talasheri and set up a mission station. He comes from the city of Stuttgart. And in my book, I talk about how the Germans are little different from the British. While both the European countries agree that there has to be some kind of education for the poor, the Germans have a very, very different understanding of education itself. And for them, education is very closely tied to work as a moral duty. So in the Basel Mission boarding schools, they were training children to become apprentices in the tile factories and in the weaving factories of the Basel Mission. Again, if you are familiar with the tile factories in Farooq, in Palakkad, the weaving factories in Calicut, in Kozhikode, in Kannur, these are all started by the Basel Mission. And there was a demand supply chain between the boarding schools and the industry. And unlike the British LMS and CMS, the Basel Mission did not believe in mass conversion. They did not allow groups of people to convert. They believed in individual conversion where everybody had to publicly confess their sins. And because of that very strict approach, they had far lesser converts than the LMS and CMS in South Kerala. One of the advantages of studying the Basel Mission, or one of the historiographical advantages, is that it allows me to look at other characters or other white actors in the story of imperialism. Very often we think empire is only about the British in India, but if you look carefully, there are pockets of other kinds of whiteness. And although the Germans were friendly with the British, we can see that there is a lot of tension between the Germans and the British. And in 1914, when the First World War started, the German missionaries were taken as war prisoners, and they were all asked to go back to Germany. And the British government in Malabar took over all the profits of the Basel Mission and their industries, and which was called the Commonwealth in the factory in North Malabar, the Commonwealth Trust, Industrial Trust. As a mechanism for cultivating self-restraint and discipline, seemingly absent in local social life, according to the European missionaries, girls' and boys' school timetables became synonymous with heralding new ideals and norms of behavior for gendered socialization and identity formation. A timetable-based routinized schooling was very central to the making of modern childhood. Mission boarding school compounds, like the picture that you see, duplicated the division between private and public work between the sexes. And many of the tasks that occurred outside of the classrooms were to prepare girls to become future good mothers and good wives. But for the boys, it was not to prepare them necessarily as husbands and fathers, but as members of agricultural and social life. The Protestant missions placed the onus of domestic labor as an essential constituent of their character formation on the female boarding school pupils. Their daily timetables show how colonized children's bodies were gradually socialized into functioning as efficient agents with no time to idle away in so-called trivial pursuits. These children were taught in the vernacular languages by local teachers, religious scriptures, reading, writing, arithmetic, grammar, history, and geography. A closer look at the boarding schools cum orphanages run by the Basel Mission in Malabar highlights the multiple ways in which labor reconfigured the identities of poor low-caste children as they continued to occupy the lower rungs of the mission hierarchy. As was the case with all charitable institutions, girls and boys in the Basel Mission's boarding schools carried out laborious daily tasks such as cooking, cleaning, winnowing rice, gardening, and washing under the close supervision of their teachers. Several older male students were also required to learn carpentry, weaving, tailoring, and smithery, and worked as apprentices to mission managers or local artisans. These artisanal skills. So the question I ask is, why were the Basel missionaries teaching these kind of crafts and skills? And that's because they themselves came from villages in Germany where they were artisans. So that's what they knew best, and they were trying to transmit those same ideas. These artisanal skills reflected the missionaries' own pre-industrial backgrounds in southwestern Germany, and the trades they were most familiar with. From the 1860s onwards, the Basel Mission distinguished themselves by investing heavily in weaving and tiling factories, which provided large-scale employment for their literate converts and introduced new ways of labor organization. Although a new enterprise, the Basel Mission received intense criticism from other European missionary groups in colonial South India, namely the British, for earning substantial profits in the name of religion. So what you see is, by the 1900s, the British missionaries are criticizing the German missionaries for making profit, because they say we are here to educate and convert. We are not here to make profit. But the Basel mission really does not get upset by this kind of criticism. The Basel mission argued that Christians in Malabar had to be withdrawn from quote unquote evil influences as far as possible, and from a young age onwards, the poor and destitute children had to be taught the Protestant ethics of work. Towards this, they persuaded whom they called unworthy parents, including converts, to turn over their sons and daughters to missionary care. Their schools functioned as sites of intense emotional formations and emotional frontiers, as poor children lived under the enormous pressure to prove to their supervisors that they had experienced a strong spiritual awakening and were open to confessing the sins. So again, for those of you who are not familiar with the Basel mission was a very strict mission. They would beat up children very, very regularly. Corporal punishment was highly prevalent. And one of the justification that the missionaries gave was that they were breaking the children's will. They were trying to make the children less sinful. But we can read it in different ways, as a form of course, disciplining the native, but also as a form of control, in which they wanted the children to be under their pastoral authority, even as adults. So if you look at the next slide, I request the coordinator to move to the next slide. You will see that the children were doing very, very heavy labor. These are photographs from 1900s. And you can understand that if half the day of the school was spent in labor, and these are very, very difficult tasks that the children were already doing outside of the school when they went back to their families during holidays or during epidemics. And inside the school also, they were made to do all this. So the missionaries are getting quite a bit of free labor from the children. Next slide, please. Here is a quote from one of the school supervisors in the Talisheri boarding school for the girls. And you can clearly see how there is no regret or reflection on using corporal punishment. In fact, the assumption was that the Malayali child is an evil child and they have to be beaten. Today, we associate schooling with punishment, but we can see punishment had various meanings at this time. And I quote, this is from Mr. Hassan Vandal, and he says, "One girl who was punished now and then would afterwards try in different ways to reconcile me and draw a kind word from me, either by bringing flowers or by some other means. Another girl was severely punished for telling lies. She came afterwards, asked my pardon, and said the punishment had been necessary as she had really been on the point of becoming a bad girl." So these kind of punishments are very common, and in the book I try to understand what does this mean. Why is punishment very central to modern schooling? We will see that as the period progresses, and today we associate teachers as semi-parents, as quasi-parents. So when parents send their children to school, the assumption is that the teacher will function as a parent and therefore has the right to beat their child to make them a better person, right? So today we take it for granted, but we can see what is happening is a negotiation of authority between the biological parent or the adopted parent and the teacher who functions as a parent. I'm also interested in understanding the evolution of the Malayali parent or the Indian parent. So what the missionaries and the British government did is that they kept on criticizing Indian families as sites of defects, that Indian families are incapable, quote unquote, incapable of taking care of their children. And what does that mean? It means they were basically saying that their ways of taking care of children were unscientific, that Indian parents did not understand nutrition, did not understand how much love to be given. Indian parents could not control the temptations of their children, or they were allowing them to be savage-like. And we see the same language today in international relations. So just to give you an example of how does my research speak to contemporary situation is, many of you might be aware that of the scandal in Norway, where many Indian parents in the last few years have lost their children to the Norwegian child service, to the social service. And the accusation of the Norwegian government is that immigrant parents are incapable of taking care of their children. And this idea that non-white races are not doing a good job of raising children is prevalent even today. That brown people and black people are not good parents. And therefore, the only people who can take care of children in a modern way are the white populations, is an idea that is emerging at this time in various ways. There was not a unilinear process of disciplining, which is made clear by the Basel Mission's archives, as missionaries regularly reported on their modes of punishment and the sharp responses it evoked in children. Now, I'm not saying it's a unilinear process where the children did not react. So in my book, I outline the ways in which children exercise their agency. You can call it limited agency or fleeting agency, but children also resisted this kind of a disciplinary regime on them. In the Basel Mission schools, very often children were running away. They were refusing to listen to the missionaries. Sometimes they would call their parents, if they were alive, to come and take them away. So it was not easily accepted. This kind of imposition of a punishment or a harsh regime was not bleakly received by Indian children. Next slide, please. So you can see that one of the children actually resisted, but the way the missionary talks about the child is in a very humiliating manner. It's in a very degrading manner, and you can see what Wilhelm Schmolt, the superintendent of the Talisheri Boys School, is talking about a young boy who had fits, and he actually says, afflicted with frequent epileptic fits, the school supervisor tended more to the boy, who became extremely quote unquote uncontrollable and undisciplined with time. And Schmalk reported, in January, he was sent to Palakkad for a change of air. After his return, we had the impression that he rather liked the return of his fits. He grew overbearing. He was not content with his food and clothes, would always idle about and insulted his comrades. When one day he got a sound beating for this bad behavior, his epileptic fits ceased and never returned. A few weeks afterwards, he ran away with another discontented boy, first to Palakkad, where he had some relatives, and from thence to Cochin. The clergyman there put him in an English school and several months afterwards sent him back to his European father in Calcutta. On his way there, he paid us a visit, looking like a scarecrow in European clothes, pretending to have forgotten his native tongue and to know only English. So you can see that this entire report is reeking of racism. It is reeking of a kind of contempt for the native. So this contempt that this boy actually asserted his right to leave, that he had a father who was European. We know in Malabar, many Tiya women had sexual unions with European soldiers. Perhaps this boy was a result of that union. And he is asserting himself by saying that I'm going back to my European father. But the Basel Mission has so much contempt, saying that he knows a bit of English and he thinks he's a European now, but he's actually a scarecrow. There is a mocking of the Malayali or the native for trying to become like a European person, but also the assumption that he was uncontrollable because he was not disciplined. But if you read between the lines, you can see that there was a lot of discontentment in the school because he ran away with another boy. And you will see that in the reports that many boys and girls are running away from the Basel Mission because the atmosphere is very, very suffocating for them. Next slide, please. So these are the factories of the Basel Mission in Farooq. You will see the tile factories and the weaving factories. And these are some of the pictures of the local congregations. Next slide, please. I move away. So after I look at the Christian missionaries, the last part of my book is interested in looking at the secularization of education. Because I'm not going into the details, but after 1854 Charles Wood's dispatch, there is a lot of change in missionary enterprises. They are not able to compete in the same way as government schools. In Travancore and Cochin, the monarchy is going to start investing in primary education. That is going to create a lot of tension with these Christian schools. They don't have the money to expand. They are now brought under the grant and aid policy. When they become aided schools, they have to follow regulations of the government. And what you see is one of the regulations of the grant and aid was that you must use textbooks prescribed by the state. Then only you can get grant and aid. And I argue in my book that textbooks are also a form of representing this ideal child. The textbooks are a way of inculcating in readers this normative ideal of who a good child should be. And so there is a relationship between textbooks, moral education, and the subject of political economy. Political economy was a very popular subject in the early parts of the 20th century, especially in the British Empire, in parts of Ireland, where Irish educators were writing the earliest political economy texts, especially the one you see on the screen, Easy Lessons on Money Matters. It was a book written in the 1830s by Richard Whately. Whately was the Archbishop of Ireland. He was based in Dublin. That book became so popular that it was converted into 33, 34 languages across the empire, and it was used in the curriculum even in Travancore for many, many years. But you can see that the book came in 1830s, but it was translated and used only in 1870. So by the time it is used in South India, it's a bit later and the subject has lost its popularity. But it is an attempt to teach children on how to use money, how to participate in an economy, how to invest, how to save, and basically to say that capitalism is good. So if you read the book, you will see that they're trying to say capitalism is a form of creating charity for the poor if you work very well, and you can become a capitalist if you also work very hard. And I argue in the book that these kind of lessons that were being taught to children was to create this idea of good children, of disciplined good children. On the other side, you will see Joseph Mulliel. Joseph Mulliel, at this time, he was an English tutor in the Madras Christian College. Later, he was promoted as the translator to the government of Madras as a Malayalam translator. He was a Basel mission convert. He was a very well-known school teacher. He came from a well-known family, the Mulliel Taravat family. And he was very close to the Basel mission as a convert and was very influenced by their thinking. But because he was so good in Malayalam, he was hired to write textbooks. And his textbooks were very popular in the Malabar schools. And what he does is he used parts of Richard Whatley's Easy Lessons, Dana Tattva Nirupanam, he reproduces it in different parts in the Malabar textbooks. And this is a tactic that is used in Bengal, it is used in Tamil textbooks, where political economy lessons appear alongside other lessons in children's books. But I argue in my book that Mulliel does a subversion. Because Mulliel is coming from a lower caste, he uses the idea of political economy for children to basically argue that capitalism will never come to Malabar because of the caste system. And therefore, if you want to have a capitalist system where everybody can benefit from its profits, then you must challenge caste system itself. So he makes a very interesting subversion in his textbook. While he remains very, very moralistic, he's very, very Christian moralistic at this time, he does not see any contradiction with his critique of caste feudalism. And you will see that these textbooks are about it. Joseph Mulliel is also the author of this book called Sukumari. Many of you may have heard of Sukumari, the story of the young girl who goes to a Basel Mission girls boarding school. Next slide, please. Yeah. An arena in which the concerns of both the princely and colonial administrations overlapped in the 20th century was that of school textbook production. In the debate on the language of public instruction, colonial British administrators intended to disseminate Western forms of knowledge largely through translation in Indian languages. This mode of translatability enabled Indian authors to adapt and introduce new categories of thought for their readers, and in the process, move away from the originally intended set of encoded meanings laid out by imperialist authors. At the level of primary instruction, preoccupied with the ideological aims of forging moral readers and dutiful subjects, deferent to the ideals of the empire, a substantial amount of vernacular school textbooks continued to be adapted on the lines of popular English and Irish readers and primers, with minor changes to names of characters and contexts. In my book, I examined two sets of Malayalam readers, one recommended in Travancore and written by Edmund Marsden, who was a government official, and the other in Malabar, written by a prominent Tia convert to the Basel mission, Joseph Mullian. Both were compilations of lessons from various books and tailored to meet the local terminology and context of Malayali child readers, with an emphasis on certain emotion virtues steeped in didactic oppositional binaries of good, bad child. The popularization of self-help. The self-help was a major idea in political economy, industry, and improvement that echoed in mass schooling across the empire. So as you can see from the quote here, what these textbooks try to do is that basically it tries to say that poverty is your problem. Poverty is because the individual is lazy, the individual is unproductive, the individual is immoral, and it is not a structural problem. Because that was what Richard Watley was trying to say, that don't blame the capitalists for poverty. You have to become a better person in order to come out of poverty. And again, we know this is the same discourse happening today in countries like India, where very often the elites will blame the poor for not working hard enough. And that is why they are poor. But you can see the historical precedents happening in school books. And in this chapter from the Travancore government Macmillan school book reader called Kulikar, Wage Laborers, you will see a similar story where Shankar and Raman are brothers. They were very wealthy and then they become indebted and they borrow money and they suffer. But there is no discussion here to the reader about caste or other kind of structural differences or feudalism. The poverty is seen as an individual economic and a moral lack. That is why my book is looking at the relationship between morality and political economy, how education is considered a solution to solve this moral lack or the lack of morality in poor children. Next slide, please. Now, towards the end of the book, and this is my conclusion, so thank you for waiting for so long. After the discussion on textbooks, what I'm trying to then argue is, because the textbook is an instrument of the state, textbook is a reminder that the state is bureaucratizing education. By the 20th century, another development is also happening. That is the emergence of popular deliberative councils. For us, by the first decade of the 20th century, we have the Travancore Srimulam Popular Assembly and the Cochin Legislative Council, which also happens a few years later. In these bodies, what is happening is there is now a debate on mass schooling. There is a debate now on should there be compulsory primary education for our children. Those of you who are aware, the right to compulsory primary education in Travancore and Cochin come very late in the 1948, around 47, 46, 47, 48. And what I show in the book is that 20 to 30 years is spent debating on this. Today, we take it for granted because of the Right to Education Act. We are all in this room agreeing that all children should get compulsory education. But historically, that was not the case. Members of these parliamentary councils, or let's say representative councils, could not agree. They refused to agree on compulsory education. And the word compulsion was a major point of contestation. And what I'm trying to argue is that the poor child is now being transformed into a poor pupil. So this transformation of a child into a school student as a student category, goes through these processes in which the state is now claiming the child as an asset. So until the mid-19th century, the child was a family's responsibility, a community asset, a community's problem. But by the 20th century, and in Kerala, we are living through that process, the child is a focus of the state itself. which is why the government is very invested in the child. Political parties are interested in children, although children are not coming out openly as political agents. Whole society is interested in children because everybody is debating on the future of their society through the quality of the children that they are producing. And I show in the book that there is a huge debate in the Cochin Legislative Council between the dominant groups and the Irava groups, where the Irava groups are asking for compulsory education at the primary level for poor children. And they are being told and they're being mocked by saying, what is the point of giving you primary education? One, there are no jobs. Two, you will stop doing manual labor. What will happen to the system? And three, we cannot upset the social order by giving education to all of you. So next slide, please. And that's my last slide. So you can see M.K. Raman, he's a member of the CLC, he's from a Irava community, and he gets very angry in 1926 because the entire session is fighting about the question of compulsory education. And Raman says, I do not understand why those who have had the good fortune of being born in a higher community thinks a Pulaya is only fit to be working in the field or servant and the Brahmana superior work. I submit that even a little education will improve their work. Today, there is no point in division of labor, and intelligence is not distributed exclusively among members of one community. We are talking of elementary education here, fundamental for all. This is again echoing the merit debate. Today, we have this terrible debate of merit and the idea that only certain communities are intelligent by birth. We know it's a very, very flawed, unscientific idea, but we can see in the 1920s this was being debated. And we also know that in 1911, Bal Gangadhar Tilak opposed Gopalakrishna Gokhale's resolution on compulsory education. So 10 years before the debate in Cochin, the debate in the Imperial Council was Gokhale's bill was defeated by another Indian, that is Tilak, saying that there is no point educating poor people in India, lower caste should not be educated. You have the same argument happening in Cochin and Travancore on what should this be, or what should be the indicator, and why can't we send poor children to technical and vocational schooling and industrial schools and not to the mainstream schools? So the fear was that lower caste children are not fit for intellectual labor, but they are fit for manual labor and therefore should go to only industrial schools. And Dr. K.N. Sunandan, who has written a fantastic book last year on caste and education, he also argues that there is great resistance by the subaltern communities to go to industrial school. They don't want to go to industrial school because they want to participate in this democratizing of public sphere and their rights. And they also want to claim education as a right. And finally, in 1948, Travancore and Cochin will agree after the Second World War, and there is less opposition to compulsory education when they will pass the bill after 22 years of discussion. In conclusion, the running thread of my book has been to historicize the interconnections between mass schooling practices provoked by European evangelical missionary action and their ambiguous encounters with varied poor subaltern communities. Today, one can reasonably assume that the necessity of formal education for proper childhood formation is commonplace across classes and communities in Kerala. However, this assumption was historically absent in the policies of early 19th century feudal monarchical rulers and the parochial interests of the violent dominant caste communities. Yet what has eventually emerged from these absences has been a volatile history of state-society relations in the field of education and the various attempts to control and regulate poor children from low-income families and limit their aspirations. We observe that the historical production and reproduction of spatial and socio-economic inequalities occurs in the interstices of curriculum and pedagogies that govern the lives of poor children. As of 2021, there are almost 35 lakh domestic migrant workers in Kerala, mainly from the states of Assam, Bengal, and Odisha. This has resulted in a definite shift in educational policy, as evident in the launching of Project Roshni in the district of Ernakulam to encourage migrant children to learn the regional language for schooling and social purposes until class 4 in government schools. What implications these will have in the long term are yet to be fully documented. In a sense, the category of the poor child is itself in a state of transition because of these demographic shifts. Compared to the poor Malayali child of the early 20th century, today the poor Malayali child in Kerala mainly is also a migrant child. As Malayali society passes through another transformational phase in terms of both new linguistic and economic aspirations, with the intensification of neoliberalism and concomitant inequalities, the questions with which my book began are relevant in understanding the assumptions and motivations underpinning systems of governance seeking to define poor childhoods. So, my question of who should go to school, how much, have become, I would say, more relevant today as migrant children have started entering Kerala's government schools and saving our schools. And therefore, as a society, we will have to rethink what does it mean to be educating the poor child. So thank you so much for your patience, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Coordinator, please.
Thank you, Dr. Divya Kannan, for your presentation. Sir, there are no more questions on the chat box. Would you like to make any comment on the talk?
Yeah, thank you very much for your pretty interesting presentation on something which of my own interest also. I got to make only two comments here. One is regarding your characterization of what is called a poor child. Anyway, I hope there'll be some explanation regarding that, because I think poverty is, as you yourself pointed out, is the only way, not the only way of characterizing a child. Anyway, that is one thing. But there is one question which I would like to present is the question of the concept of a school. I hope you might have referred to it in your book somewhere, because the school, the concept of a school rather, a regular kind of institution working from morning to evening on a rigorous schedule is something that is foreign to the educational environment anywhere in India, except for the Pathshalas in West Bengal, maybe. But apart from that, in Kerala at least, there are no concept of a school of that kind. We have had Eluthupallis and Pallikudams, which are very, very different in concept. Even for an upper caste and upper class child, this is very different from that of a school. And second thing is that school, again, seems to be a missionary product, as you yourself pointed out. That seems the concept of a school, as it was introduced, at least by people like Reverend Norton in the beginning, it seems to have been, inspired by the grammar schools of England, rather than any other kind of schools that were actually developing in Europe and other places. So how does the concept of a school is related to the colonial governance, one, the missionary activities, as well as the kind of disciplining process which you yourself were pointing out? And how does it result in the transformation of labor from a feudal bondman labor of a different kind to what you yourself called as the new form of labor or the capitalist labor? So does the school play any role in that? Does the disciplining of the school play any role in that, according to your own information regarding the concept of school that developed in 19th century? That is one question. Second is regarding a point which you pointed out regarding the kind of debates that were taking place in Cochin Legislative Assembly. You are yourself pointing out, where, for example, the upper castes, not the colonial, not the missionaries in their own ways, but the upper castes were trying to prevent the poor, as if we, from entering their schools. Now, which means that the upper caste were now fully, accepting the colonial school, accepting the colonial school as a mode of their transformation. That is the middle class that is developing, including the upper caste and upper class, were now accepting the colonial school as a form of transformation of themselves, which means that a new contradiction is appearing between the colonial middle class, which is now trying to patronize the whole concept of school appropriated to themselves, and actually rejecting the claims of, the poorer sections, including the backward sections, from entering that kind of a school. So there seems to be two contradictions that were operating. One is between the earlier kinds of thing and the new colonial elite now trying to prevent the other people from entering the school. Is there such a difference?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Ganesh. I mean, I would say you answered the question yourself to a large extent, but you're absolutely right. The category of the poor child, one of course is poverty, but then poverty is also very much related to caste, and also in the kind of occupations that the children find themselves. So not just
It is also labor. I think it is also a question of labor. Yeah.
The question of labor. So not just for the Dalits, many of them who are agrestic slaves, but what we today call as OBC, those communities were also in lower forms of labor, or at least devalued labor, in which that's why I call it a circular logic of poverty. So, and of course, here I'm also saying the poor child is also considered poor, quote unquote poor. Like we say pavam in terms of Malayalam.
That's the problem.
So a lot of them are also seen through charity, and therefore sick children. So leprosy-stricken children, orphans, delinquents, runaways, famine, children who are suffering famine in parts of South India. They are all brought together under the category of this poor child. So there is, of course, the poor child because of structural factors of poverty and labor and feudalism. But then there is also the poor child, sometimes and quite rarely, but also coming from dominant caste communities into the missionary fold. So there are these both sections that come. The question of, you're absolutely right. So Thomas Norton and others are inspired by the grammar school, because back in England also the missionary organizations are invested in domestic reform. So the LMS is also doing a lot of domestic social reform, and grammar school was seen as a way in which poor English children or working class Irish children could also be trained in basics of literacy as well as discipline techniques. Now, because the missionaries came to the empire or stations in the empire for conversion, and conversion required that they should read the Bible at least. That was a minimum expectation. The missionaries could not really run away from the question of teaching them how to read. So that is why writing is a very different process. Writing was considered a slightly advanced skill, which they were not very keen on teaching many of them. But at least the ability to read the Bible was an imperative in starting the schools. And you're absolutely right in reading what I said correctly. I think the interpretation is correct. That earlier the Pallikudam or the Eluthupalli was also an informal setup. It was also a community kind of obligation. What happens, and I write this in the first chapter of my book in detail, is that the figure of the Ashan is criticized a lot. And in fact, the missionaries and the government is going to call the Ashan a mini Oriental despot. So there is a lot of stereotyping of the Ashan as ignorant of scientific skills, who does not know how to teach children properly, who's nothing but a dictator. So there is this from all quarters, not just the missionaries. Colonial authorities are writing about it. So much so that by the time the Travancore manual comes, so you can see even Nagamaya, who in the beginning was praising the Ashan, by the time the next manual comes, he has started to say that maybe the Ashan is an outdated figure. And that is linked to your next question. That is, as the colonial market expands and as the demand for new jobs are increasing in the bureaucracy, there is now the devaluation that perhaps this traditional form of schooling is not the right way to go. And the skills that the Ashan was teaching mainly is suited only for an agrarian society. It is not really suited for the changing colonial market society. And that will drive many of these emerging middle class communities to participate in what is called bureaucratized schooling. So like you said, schooling then becomes both an institutional enterprise, it becomes a separate physical form, as well as something that the families are expected to do, and no longer a community obligation or a family obligation. It is something like almost like a civic duty that they're expected to do. And these middle classes will now participate in these kind of formal schools, which are now going to be regulated by the grant and aid policies, the Hunter Commission, and various education policies of the British government, which have very strict prescriptions of the curriculum, what is to be taught, etc. Because these jobs will allow the graduates of the schools to apply for clerical jobs. So, for instance, the introduction of the vernacular school leaving certificate. Today we call it this SSLC certificate, but the vernacular school leaving certificate, the English school leaving certificate, all of that will become bureaucratized, indicators. It will become a proof that you have finished your schooling to build certain capacities that can make you eligible for certain jobs. And you're absolutely right in saying that the middle classes will eye these jobs in the colonial administration. And what they will do is they will push out other communities and prevent other communities from participating. So one thing I didn't mention here is that the missionaries also ran different kinds of schools. So they had very poor charity schools for very, very poor people, barely class 1 and 2, 1 or 2 rooms in the schools, which later the Travancore government shut down. Koji Kawashima has written very extensively about it. Then they also had high schools in which they were mainly upper caste children or Tamil Brahmin children in Travancore, or in parts of central Travancore, Syrian Christian students would go for the CMS high school. So the CMS had their very small primary vernacular school, but in their Anglo vernacular schools, they had the richer Christians going. Then they had the colleges, which we know the history of the CMS college. CMS college did not allow Dalit students until the beginning of the 20th century. So you will see that even within the missionary landscape, they are catering to different caste communities. A question that I often get is, were the missionaries casteist? Now, I don't really say yes or no, because it was a form of negotiation. The missionaries had to survive. They wanted to curry favor with the upper caste. They also wanted converts because the pressure back home was very immense. But so they compromise. So there is a lot of compromise on the part of the missionary who will then run very different schools. And you are right, which is why M.K. Raman in 1926 is going to accuse the upper caste in Cochin by saying, you have used all the facilities of the government schools, and today you are refusing to let us enter the school. So you will see a similar history being reported there. So you're right. The disciplining of these children are also to make them better workers. But I would say beyond better workers, it's also kind of recasting the self. They're also being introduced to some kind of modernity in which there is a refashioning of the body itself. And time and route and timetable is very central to this refashioning of the self. And today we know all schools work on timetables, but the idea was the body is a machine, and the body should work like a well-oiled machine in certain time. So a kind of E.P. Thompson argument, but this time work was very important for this kind of participation in industrial labor as well. I can see a question on the chat box that was asked about the Nadar community, Abhita, and this is related to Professor Ganesh's question. You're absolutely right. The poor child is negotiating quite a bit, and particularly in the Nadar community, they are negotiating. There is a good book by Dick Kuiman, where he says that a lot of the Nadar boys in the LMS boarding schools, they later became managers of coffee plantations in Ceylon, in Sri Lanka, because they were taught a bit of English. That English learning allowed many of them to, get new jobs, and they came back and established churches and schools in Kanyakumari, in Nagarkoil, in Neyur, in Parashala, in Marthandam. So the Nadar community really did. But we know that the Nadar community, not everybody converted. So there are Hindu Nadas, there are Christian Nadas, but education had a multiplier effect. The Hindu Nadas also started building schools and also started investing in schools. So one of the legacies of the missionaries, I would say, is that all communities started competing for schools, which is why today in Kerala, education is a big competitive asset. Every community is invested in education, and that is what the missionaries are going to trigger. All community associations will realize that the school as an institutional space where children have to be removed from the family space after some time and trained very, very specifically is going to be one of the legacies of that school. But you're right, the Nada children do negotiate quite a bit. In fact, many of the first teachers and nurses in South Travancore, they were also coming from these Nadar girls boarding schools. The question by Pramod Deshpande is about producing textbook. You will see that also. You're right about seeing the dissent in Bombay Presidency. Now in Kerala, because Mr. Pramod, because there is Malabar. Malabar is governed by the Madras Presidency Textbook Committee regulations, and a lot of the textbooks in Malabar are actually direct translations of Tamil or English textbooks in the presidency. They are not specifically written for Malabar Malayali children. But in Travancore and Cochin, there are separate Travancore committees. In Travancore, it was headed by Kerala Kovil Tampuran, who was a member of the royal family. He was a poet himself, and he was very pro-European textbooks. So a lot of the textbooks were translated under his supervision. But unfortunately, there is a lot of royal intrigue and a lot of family politics, and he is house arrested for a few years, and the textbook committee stops functioning. At that time, you will see that again they are going back to translation. And you are absolutely right, there are a lot of dissent between the lower caste reformers and upper caste reformers, but not so much on the textbooks itself, because Malayalam was not a very common language for translation. It was actually Tamil. So you have English to Tamil translation, and then from Tamil textbooks to Malayalam translation. There are some original Malayalam textbooks also being written, which are used in the 20th century. But we don't see much of a dissent in the kind of reporting of community history. What we see today, that is not there in the early 20s. At least I have not come across any textbook-based concern. There is, of course, concern about gender, whether our girls should read these textbooks, whether these textbooks are teaching our girls to become good girls. That is a major concern as such. Your other question about what way Indian reformers from lower caste project the education emancipatory to both. I'm not very sure of what you are trying to say. In what way Indian reformers project the education emancipatory? I do think following Ambedkar and others, lower caste communities do see colonial education as liberatory, because at least by law, British schools allowed everybody to enter the school. Now, the question I ask is, yes, by law, they were allowed to enter the schools, but did the social elites actually allow them to enter? Did the schools actually provide equal facilities to everybody? Then you will see that there are a lot of fractures. So on one hand, it is emancipatory because it allows some kind of democratization of literacy skills. But the question to really ask is, what is the nature of education? What are poor children actually being taught? Are they encouraged to become scientists? Are they encouraged to do things beyond agriculture? You will see that that is a very recent phenomenon. It's at least till the 1940s, the number of lower caste children entering schools are very, very little. Srijit, your question about have you observed any difference in Basel Mission in North and South Malabar? Now, the thing is, they were very popular in North Malabar, and as we know, the Brennan College was controlled by the Basel Mission. The Basel Mission did not establish the Brennan College. Brennan was the name of a English person, but they were asked to to take care of Brennan College. And you are right, the Tia middle classes are emerging in North Malabar, like Dilip Menon and others have pointed out, is because many of the Tias are getting English educated. So you will see that English education is helping them. They're migrating to Ceylon. They're migrating to parts of the Madras presidency. And one of the reasons for the middle classes not emerging in South Malabar is a lot of the poorer Muslim populations also live in South Malabar, and many of them belong to the agricultural communities. So they do not have the same economic status as the Tias in North Malabar. And that is probably one of the reasons, there has been a recent book on the emergence of middle classes that you see a major difference. But the Basel Mission had very few schools. So there is not much of a difference in the way they function. They were very anti-Muslim. The Basel Mission was very anti-Roman Catholic. They were very anti-Muslim. And they were not very successful in attracting these two communities to their schools. So that much I can tell you. Satyan, your question, can the present day evil of No, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that the Germans were bad people and therefore corporal punishment is a German thing. I would say that, Mr. Satyan, I would say all communities practice corporal punishment. What I'm trying to say is that the Basel Mission was more strict than the British. The reason why I am not able to tell you about the punishment in the LMS and CMS schools is because they never wrote about them. If you go to the archives, they didn't write about them, but the Germans are writing a lot about punishment, which made me wonder, why is an organization writing so much about punishing children? Maybe they thought they were doing the right thing. But if you see the slide I showed you earlier, corporal punishment in vernacular schools, it is a small tract written by Edgar Thurston. He was an amateur anthropologist in the Madras presidency. He went around today's Andhra Pradesh, documenting the various ways in which ashans or local teachers were punishing their children. So corporal punishment existed long before the Europeans came. And I think the idea of punishing the child is there in every society as a form of control and as a form of breaking children's independence in order to make them docile and subservient. It's just that the Germans were a bit more stricter. Srijit, your second question, what sources after the German missionaries were sent back? No, I do not look back. I don't look at what happened post-World War because, it's already a long thesis. But you will find that all the churches were participating in the Church of South India. So by the 1950s, there is a Indianization of the churches. And like you said, they all become under the CSI. Many schools were taken over by the government. So perhaps if you go to these schools, you will find the records. You will find it in the Kerala archives in Trivandrum or in Calicut under the Department of Education. Many of them had files with the Department of Education and how they were managed. And there's quite a bit in the gazetteers and in the census reports on the kind of policies that were used. But it's an interesting topic if you're interested in looking at. I have a question on the vernacular education. Just a second, sorry. These foreclosure possibilities. Yes, yes, you're absolutely right. But in Kerala, English education is never banned. In Bengal, for a period, there was in the 90s they were not teaching English. But in Kerala, there was no conscious policy ban on English education. But of course, the divide is there. Leah Matthew has written very astutely about it. And it is there all over India. This aspiration to learn English, but also what kind of English. And that is why which school you go to really matters. Because, but today we know that poorer communities cannot afford elite schools, so they send them to low-cost private schools. But they necessarily don't guarantee a good English education. So there is a lot of politics given to English education caste. So I agree with you there. Now, about the migrant children and Malayali children studying together, I must admit that I'm not an ethnographer, so I'm not really aware of the anxieties within the school, but I am aware of the social anxieties. Otherwise, there is a lot of stereotyping of the migrant. There is also a lot of suspicion of the migrant as somebody who will, bring lawlessness to Kerala, who are reducing the civic culture of Kerala, who are, let's say, bringing unclean habits to Kerala. That has been a major concern, anxiety. The anxiety of migrant children has been more pedagogical because many Malayali teachers have been trained in Hindi and other languages in order to teach them. There is an anxiety of the jobs, but the greater anxiety is actually about the future of the school itself. Many government schools in Kerala are not getting enough children to be enrolled every year, because of which there is a huge concern about whether they will be shut down or not. So that anxiety is there. But your question is very relevant. I think if there is research on, what is the interaction between the Malayali and the non-Malayali child in these schools, that might be interesting to look at. But the good news is that in many of the state board exams in the last few years, non-Malayali children are doing very well. They are actually topping the exam. So perhaps something positive is happening in the pedagogy that they're able to catch up. And Malayalam, as you know, is a very difficult language. So therefore, there is some kind of positive interaction happening between the schools and the communities that is enabling migrant children to also integrate into Malayalam medium schools better. Yeah, that's all I can tell you now. Thank you all so much for these questions. Very helpful to improve my future research as well. Coordinator,
There
would
is
you-
a raise hand option by Divin Paul.
yeah, sure,
Divin
sure.
Paul, you can ask the question directly. Divin Paul?
Hello, madam. Can you hear me?
Sure. You can
Uh,
proceed.
Actually, I'm a research scholar in Calicut University. Especially the topic. My topic is actually the background of the Basel Evangelical Mission in Colonial Malabar. Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, madam. Okay, madam. Actually, my research area is the speciality and social engineering in Colonial Malabar. In my research, a topic education provided by the Basel Evangelical Missionaries among the low caste people in Malabar. Madam, my question is there any caste discrimination in our schools or boarding homes? Is there any caste discrimination? Is there any studies regarding the caste discrimination in colonial Malabar, especially the low caste people in who are living in boarding or schools?
That is okay.
Yeah. So, Divin, the thing is, this is related to Srijit's question. The Basel mission, like I told you, had very less converts. So, in 1914, they only have 3,000, 4,000 converts, whereas the LMS and CMS have more than 100,000 converts. And many of the converts of the Basel mission actually come from the Tia community.
Yes.
Because they came from a similar community, there is you at least I did not read in the reports of caste discrimination within the schools. There is racial discrimination. The European teachers are treating them very differently. But because they come from similar castes and people of other castes were very, very few. So there were some Nair students, there were some mixed students, mixed race Portuguese descendants, there were Syrian Christian students, but they're very, very few in number. But the discrimination is actually in the LMS and CMS schools. So there is a lot of discrimination in the CMS schools between Syrian Christian children, upper caste children, and Dalit children. But as I told Professor Ganesh, they are being taught in different schools. So very often the upper castes are not allowing to be mixed. The LMS, what you see is in South Travancore, the Nadars are dominating the churches, and they are very anti-Dalit in many parts of South Travancore. And the Dalits are in North Travancore with lesser resources. And, so they are concentrated in those parts. So there is actually more open discrimination in the British churches than in the Basel Mission Church. One is because of the number, and one is because of one community converting to Basel Mission in most numbers, in high numbers. But you will see more cases of discrimination for the British rather than for the Basel Mission. It's a purely statistical thing because they had very few converts.
Thank you, madam. Thank you very much.
Professor Vadakanil, would you like to make any comment on it? Comment on the lecture? Hello, sir. Hello, Dinesh sir. Okay, now it's the time to wind up the session.
Dinesh sir. The Dinesh sir ഇത് പറ്റി ഇവിടെ ഇരിക്കുക. You continue, complete it.
Okay.
Complete ചെയ്തോ?
Okay. Thank you, Professor K. N. Ganesh, for chairing the session. Thank you, Professor Dinesh Vadakanil, for providing all kinds of support for the official performance. Thank you, Dr. Divya Kannan, for being part of our webinar. Thank you for the participants for actively taking part in the program. And finally, thank you for the entire KCHR team, especially Gautam Das, our project assistant, Sandhya SN, our publication assistant, Hida, our computer operator, and Jishnu, our graphic designer, for supporting me during the entire coordination of the event. Our next webinar is scheduled to be held on 22nd November by Professor P. Pavitran, retired professor, Department of Malayalam, Kaladi, Sri Shankaracharya Samskrita University, on the topic Malayalam Vijnana Bhasha enna nilayil. All are invited. Thank you.
Thank you so much.